Good evening and welcome to day 2 of our 8th annual Student Leadership Summit. I'm Lori Oldham with the Office of Student Affairs at San Diego City College. It is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce to you UCSD's Cross-Cultural Center's Social Justice Educators led by the illustrious Nancy Megpusam. Back in 2013, when I was seeking partners within higher education to collaborate with to launch our very first Student Leadership Summit, I reached out to UCSD's Cross-Cultural Center. We have a lot of values that align with our student populations. And I was so blessed to meet Nancy Megpusam, who helped me to create a stellar program for San Diego City College students. And in fact, she and her wonderful team of social justice peer educators remained an integral part of our student leadership program annually for the first 5 years. And I'm so grateful for that. And we are now at our 8th annual Student Leadership Summit. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome back Nancy and the social justice educators. Let me take a moment to introduce you to them. We're so grateful for you to be here. So with us, we have Fatima Fida, who is the Cross-Cultural Center Social Justice Educator and Outreach and Engagement Intern. We also have Tiffany Wajaja, who is Cross-Cultural Center Social Justice Educator and Common Ground Social Media and Marketing Intern. And then again, Nancy Megpusam from the Cross-Cultural Center in managing educational programs, manager for student staff and faculty. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Nancy, and thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Lori. Illustrious, that's so generous of you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm really grateful for the staff at City College. It's wonderful to see familiar faces. I feel like they're family to me whenever I come back once a year at this time. I'm going to go ahead and hand over the presentation to our wonderful facilitators, Tiffany and Fatima, and they'll tell you a little bit about themselves, their year, what they're studying, and we will go from there.
Thank you so much. We are extremely excited to be presenting our presentation on anti-Blackness and intersections of privilege. So my name is Fatima. I am a second year. My major is clinical psychology, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tiffany Wajaja. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a clinical psychology major with a photography minor. Moving on. Before we start every presentation, we like to do a land acknowledgement, so please join me as we do this land acknowledgement. As representatives of UC San Diego, we recognize our campus sits on the unsettled territory and traditional homelands of the Kumeyaay people and acknowledge their legacy. Please join me in a moment of silence to honor the original people of the land around us. Thank you. Okay, so table of contents. What will we be going over today? First, we will be going over some important key terms to know. We will be defining anti-Blackness, racism, anti-racism, white privilege, and intersectionality. The next main point we will be discussing is socialization, especially with its relation to anti-Blackness in K through 12 education and beyond. Our third main point is action. So we'll be discussing what are the actions that we can take to dismantle anti-Blackness. And finally, we'll be going over our closing remarks, which is a summary of what we discussed.
Before we begin our presentation, we would like to go over our community value/guidelines, but we would like to see from y'all and what you can expect us to enforce. So first, we greatly appreciate audience participation. If you're able to participate in the discussion questions, please do so. Second, we expect everyone to be respectful of everyone's opinions and beliefs. No personal attacks, no generalizations. You must remain respectful of every single individual. And lastly, this is a brave space, not a safe space. And what this means is that we cannot guarantee that you won't be triggered by what we are discussing today. We are discussing heavy topics such as race, racism, and anti-Blackness. If you find yourself being triggered, it's okay. If you have to step away from the screen or take a break from the presentation, please do so. Do whatever it takes to preserve your well-being. And a small disclaimer, we are using closed captioning from Google Slides. So the captioning that is at the bottom might not always be 100% accurate.
Thank you, Fatima. Now we will be going on with the presentation by going over important key terms. The first four that we would like to acknowledge are race, racism, racism as a system, and systemic racism. So what is race? Race is a social construct and a concept which signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies. Now, the difference between race and racism is that racism is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Essentially, what racism is that it is acknowledging and only identifying one individual's identity and basing off one's thoughts and perceptions of that individual from a certain identity.
Racism is a system. This is not an individual character flaw, nor a personal or moral failing. It is a system consisting of structures, policies, practices, and norms that structures opportunity and assigns the value based on phenotype, the way we look. And systemic racism is the structures in place that perpetrate racial injustices. There are three primary components to systemic racism. It's historically specific, a structural phenomenon, and regional. So historically specific, meaning that it takes place during a specific time period. A structural phenomenon, meaning that it takes place through different institutions, for instance, the government or law. And then regional, meaning that it happens within the context of a specific place. If we look at slavery, for example, it took place during a specific time in a specific area, America, and it was structured through the government and trade and things of that nature. What about white privilege? White privilege is not used to imply that white people have never struggled, nor is it used to assume that everything that a white individual has earned is not deserved. It is that white privilege is the advantages taken for granted that aren't similarly enjoyed by Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC, the sense of institutional belonging, validation, representation of values, and then representation itself, and etc. White privilege may mean that the color of your skin is not adding to your difficulty. Having white privilege and recognizing that is not a racist thing. Anti-racism. The opposite of a racist is not racist, it's anti-racist. This is a quote from Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. He is a successful professor and author. He has written books like Anti-Racist Baby, and that's a children's book. He's also written books specifically on anti-racism. So how do we reach, anti-racism is a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to racial equity and are substantiated by anti-racist. A racist is an individual who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or their inactions, or by expressing racist ideas. And an anti-racist is one who is actively supporting anti-racist policies through their actions or expressing anti-racist ideas. In the context of America, it can be difficult to be an anti-racist because it can sometimes feel like an uphill battle, because in the context of America, we have so many racist policies. this country was founded on racist. So it is easy to be complicitly racist. But it is possible to fight against racist policies. Up next, Tiffany will highlight and explain a video featuring Dr. Ibram X. Kendi and some things we can do.
Thank you, Fatima. I will be introducing this video, which aired on CBS this morning. It features Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, and the title of this video is How to Raise Kids to be Anti-Racist and Talk to Them About Racism. And we hope that this video solidifies what we are talking about today, and it has helped me understand anti-racism.
Ibram X. Kendi is author of the upcoming book, Anti-Racist Baby, about how to raise anti-racist kids. He's a CBS News contributor and joins us now. Ibram, good morning. I want to point out there was a 6-year-old girl, as we saw Ayana there talking, which shows you even really young kids are feeling what's going on right now. So how should parents be talking to them about this whole question of racial justice?
Well, actually, I think we should first emphasize that parents should be talking to their children, because I think many parents believe that babies are colorblind, that young children are colorblind, but the studies say differently. As early as 3 months, babies look more at the faces of people whose race matches their caregivers. As early as 2 years old, children discern people's behaviors based on their race. And so we should be having these conversations about race. We should be trying to teach our children that all the racial groups are equals, that we live in a beautiful rainbow of colors, and they're all on the same level and they're all equal.
Yeah, and they're also taking their cue from our own behavior, aren't they?
Oh, without question. If someone wants to raise a child who believes in justice, who's striving to be anti-racist, who believes in equality, it's important for them to be that themselves. I mean, we teach our children our philosophy. And so it's important we teach them an equitable philosophy.
We had a protester earlier in the broadcast, a young African-American woman who said, when your complexion is a weapon, you're never unarmed. And you've written about this very subject. As a Black parent, what do you tell a Black kid right now?
I think you can simultaneously talk to a Black child about how, because of the color of your skin, people are going to view you as dangerous. People are going to view you as violent. But you know what? You are not dangerous. You are not violent. There's nothing wrong with you. And if someone thinks there's something wrong with you, that means something is wrong with their ideas. And you have to always remember that. And so just as it's critical for parents of color, of children of color, to teach their children there's nothing wrong with them, there's nothing inferior about them, it's critical for white parents to teach their children there's nothing superior about them.
You say parents need to be anti-racist themselves in order to raise anti-racists. So if you're a white parent at this moment, how do you model that to your kids?
I think you model that to your kids by recognizing the true source of the problem right now. And the true source of that problem is police brutality. And the source of that source is racist policy, is the racist ideas that pervade American policing. And you should then be figuring out, okay, how can I contribute to the resistance, to the struggle against racism in this country by joining organizations, supporting policymakers who are trying to dismantle institutional racism and racist policy.
Yeah. And as you point out, Ibram, I think the most important thing is that you recognize as your kids are feeling all of this, you need to talk to them. Ibram X. Kendi, thank you. And anti-racist.
Okay, so I hope y'all enjoyed the video. One thing that stood out to me is how parents tell their children that you are not dangerous, you're not dangerous, you are beautiful, you're smart. And it's eye-opening realize that it occurs. I just had to take like a moment to think. But yeah, moving on.
Ibram X. Kendi is author of the upcoming.
Okay. Continuing on our discussion about anti-Blackness, now it occurs in a two-part formation. First, it describes the inability to recognize Black humanity. It captures the reality that the kind of violence that saturates Black life is not based on any specific thing a Black person has done.
Second, anti-Black racism is structural and systemic, which can predetermine the socioeconomic status of Blacks in this country and is held in place by anti-Black policies, institutions, and ideologies.
The third is that anti-Blackness is also the disregard for anti-Black institution and policies. This disregard is the product of class, race, and/or gender privilege certain individuals experience due to anti-Black institutions and policy. We will also be touching upon this part in one of our slides that talk about academic inferiority.
Anti-Blackness didn't start with the murder of George Floyd. So here's a list of anti-Black policies, events, and moments in histories. Of course, this is a partial list. There are many more examples. And we would love to hear from y'all or to get y'all thinking about these examples. And I'll just read some off in chronological order. So starting with the middle passage, then slavery, then we can move forward in time to the assassination of MLK and Malcolm X, the war on drugs, the Central Park Five, the Rodney King uprising, Proposition 209, Charlottesville, the Colin Kaepernick protests, and there's many more. And for more examples, some examples that I could think of off the top of my head are anti-Blackness in beauty standards that are based off of the idea of whiteness, voter suppression, redlining. These are all examples of anti-Blackness. I think it's important to keep this in mind because, as I said, anti-Blackness didn't start with the murder of George Floyd. It most certainly helped lead to the murder of George Floyd. This is something that has been happening for some time. What is intersectionality and it's important in social justice? And in advance, I think we'll apologize for the discussion questions. We were expecting something a tad bit different, but please think about this. Please consider how intersectionality is important for social justice.
And one thing I would like for y'all to keep in mind is I know that we haven't defined what intersectionality is, but we will in a brief moment. But keep in mind, try to think like what do you think intersectionality might mean and define?
Before we can explain how intersectionality is important to social justice work, we first should explain what intersectionality is. So we have a definition of intersectionality by Kimberle Crenshaw. She is credited with coining the term intersectionality. She said intersectionality is simply about how certain aspects of who you are will increase your access to good things or your exposure to bad things in life. Like many other social justice ideas, it stands because it resonates with people's lives. But because it resonates with people's lives, it's under attack. There's nothing new about defenders of the status quo criticizing those who are demanding that injustices be addressed. It's all a crisis over a sense that things might actually have to change for equality to be real. In the next slide, Tiffany and I will go more into depth about intersectionality.
Okay, thank you, Fatima, for introducing this next slide. Now, a little brief overview of intersectionality. Just to reiterate, intersectionality involves the practice of naming our identities and connecting situations of our overlapping identities to social systems of advantages and disadvantages on a continuum. we included this diagram or picture of a stick figure, and it's intersecting identities. It has a gender identity, ethnic identity, it has a class identity. So all of the individual's identities accumulate and make one being. That's, yeah.
Throughout history to present day, we can name the ways our identities have been disenfranchised or have been benefit based off of biases, social messaging, and perceptions and profiling. And I'll use myself as an example. I am an African American Muslim female. Those particular identities have a history of being marginalized, but I also have privileged identities. I'm temporarily able-bodied, I am cisgendered, and I am also heterosexual. And these in the society bring forth privileges. So these are what makes up intersectionality. Number 2, socialization in anti-Blackness in K through 12 and beyond.
Anti-Blackness in K through 12 and beyond. One example that I would like to first mention is the misinformation in history books. I would also like to ask y'all to follow along with me while I read this out loud. 15-year-old Black student Kobe Burren was in geography class at Pearland High School near Houston in the fall of 2015. As he read the assigned page of his textbook, he noticed something that deeply disturbed him: a map of the United States with a caption that said the Atlantic slave trade brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. Kobe took a picture of his textbook and texted it to his mother, adding, "We was real hard workers, wasn't we?" along with a sarcastic emoji. Not only had the McGraw-Hill textbook replaced the word slave with workers, they also placed the chapter on the enslavement of Africans in the chapter of the book titled Patterns of Immigration, as if Africans came to the United States looking for a better life. Now, why is this misinformation problematic? Well, according to the Oxford Dictionary, they defined workers as a person who works, especially one who does a particular kind of work, or someone who is employed in a company or industry, especially someone who does physical work rather than organizing things or managing people. A slave is someone who is owned by another person and is forced to work for them, or a person who is so strongly influenced by someone that they cannot live without it or cannot make their own decisions. Right then and here, it's clear that a slave and a worker are not synonyms. And essentially, these examples reveal some of the policies that result in pushing kids out of school, making it difficult to graduate, then difficult to get a job, and finally more likely that maybe it will be hard to live in the future. In the majority of textbooks, African Americans' struggle and contributions are minimized, as seen in the previous example, portrayed as blatant stereotypes or confirmed to a few roles that are acceptable to mainstream white society. The absence or destructive presence essentially begins in preschool and continues throughout a Black student's schooling. Now, we also decided to include the socialization cycle and its relativeness to anti-Blackness. But first, what is the cycle of socialization? Well, the cycle of socialization helps us understand the way in which we are socialized to play certain roles, how we are affected by issues of oppression, and how we can help maintain an oppressive system based upon power. The cycle is comprised of 3 arrows, 3 circles, and a core center. The first circle is titled the beginning and first socialization. So this is part of it is the part of socialization where there's no choice, no blame, or no guilt, and which kind of feeds into like family socialization and how parents and others we trust shape our values, teach us rules and roles.
Circle number 2 says institutional and cultural socialization and enforcement. What this means is that the institutions that surround us, for example, the government, laws and schools, and etc., as well as our culture and the way we are raised, affects the way we perceive Black individuals and the way we might perpetrate anti-Blackness.
Now, the third circle is results and actions. So this is what we carry on as adults, which could include the silence, ignorance, and guilt / self-hatred that we associate with our identities. And this can lead, as we grow and as we mature and adult, this can lead to the next generation to promote what we are taught and then lead them to believe that certain descriptions are associated with our identities. After addressing what the socialization cycle is, we would also like to introduce what implicit bias means. So essentially, implicit bias refers to the attitude or stereotypes that affects our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Implicit biases develop over the course of a lifetime, beginning at a very early age through exposure to direct and indirect messages. So in short, implicit bias factors into our decision-making and perception of other people, but based on their identities. And it's essentially what we use to assume about an individual based on their identity. Moving on, I would also like to ask y'all, what are some examples of the socialization cycle and implicit bias in educational settings? And this question will lead us into our next discussion, but I would like to leave time for y'all to gather your thoughts and think about what the answer can be. Okay, moving on. If y'all thought about anti-Blackness in K-12 education and beyond, then y'all are right. So I also would like to introduce biases, and anti-Black settings can directly affect a student's academic engagement and success, and the biases that some of us may carry can lead to the example of how some countries with higher levels of racial bias had larger Black-white test scores. Disparities may lead to decreased achievement of Black students in comparison to white students.
Knowing how much anti-Black biases exist in communities reveals differences in academics, socioeconomic status, residential segregation, and segregation as a whole. These anti-Black biases affect and disrupt different pathways for Black individuals. Anti-Blackness K-12, academic inferiority. So the belief that Black students are academically inferior, which stems from eugenics. So in 1994, a psychologist journal was published by Dr. Herrnstein and Dr. Murray, who are both psychologists who specialized in eugenics. They theorized that intelligence is inheritable and that both genes and genetics contribute to racial differences in intelligence. Though they weren't the first to believe that genetics and intelligence were linked, their work was somewhat popular at the time and was one of the many theories that were used to uphold the belief that Black people are intellectually inferior to white people. This has influenced the way Black students are perceived. These stereotypes contribute to teachers having low expectations for African American students. In the K-12 setting, it can be found that African American students, particularly males, are perceived as more hyper, immature, impulsive, and aggressive. Teachers report that Black students have more behavioral problems and fewer interpersonal skills than white children, causing Black students to be overrepresented in lower track classes and special education courses. Underrepresented in advanced classes, they are 2.4 times more likely to be placed in remedial classes. When teachers have low expectations for their students tend to have lower academic motivation and lower academic outcomes. And this is true amongst all racial and ethnic groups. When teachers tend to believe in their students less, their students believe in themselves less, therefore they do less well. An example of this on the college level would be when a professor asks a Black student in particular, how did you do well on this exam? When they have certain expectations on how well the Black students in their course should do. And as a Black student myself, I can attest to this. In multiple occasions in K through 12, I have been noticed by certain staff members because of the way I speak. They say, "You speak so eloquently, you speak so well." And even in one occasion, a staff member asked me to speak in front of other staff members just so that they could hear how well I spoke. And this is also an example of anti-Blackness. English is the only language I know, and I speak it because it's the only language I know. And to assume that Black students wouldn't be able to speak English well, or that they don't sound quote unquote Black, that is another form of anti-racism. Policing and criminalization. So suspension. Black students are more likely to be suspended than white kids over the same behavior. Suspension leads to lower grades for those students who are suspended because they are not in class and they are unable to participate. It also makes students less invested in their work because instead of trying to address the problem, students are removed from the situation, which doesn't allow them to fix the situation. In California, Black students are 9 times more likely to be suspended than white students.
Policing. Schools with predominantly Black students are more likely to be policed, and Black students are more likely to be harassed by campus police. Coming from a high school which has a large population of Latinx and Black students, there were polices on our campus almost every day, and I can attest that having police on campus does not make me feel safer, but it actually makes me a little bit more scared to be on campus.
For the idea of policing Black bodies, Black hairstyles and style in general often breaks dress codes and is deemed unprofessional. This exists through K through 12, higher education, and beyond in areas such as the workforce. Though California has the Crown Act, which was passed and stands for Create a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair, these laws are difficult to enforce and only exist in the state of California. And a story to attest to this is that my auntie, she lives in Chicago. She's an African-American woman, and she had her hair in braids. And when she came into the office, her boss said, "This is unprofessional. And when you come back to work tomorrow, you will need to have this fixed." There is nothing unprofessional about Black hair and Black bodies, but they are often undervalued. Thus, things like this happens.
Another example that we would like to mention in about anti-Blackness in K through 12 and beyond is that in October of 2015, a Black girl in South Carolina was ripped out of her desk and thrown across the room by a police officer in the school for allegedly refusing to put away her cell phone. The video captured by a classmate of the incident went viral. The officer who brutalized the girl was not charged with the crime, and instead both the girl videotaping and the girl thrown across the room were arrested and charged with disturbing schools. In May of 2017, surveillance video revealed a police officer at Woodland Hills High School in Churchill, Pennsylvania, choked and body slammed a Black boy in the office. Essentially, what this example entails is that Black bodies aren't valued, and especially in educational settings, for the main purpose of, or for because that which is seen in the example of how the police officer was not charged, but it was the girls who were blamed for the disruption. And one thing that I can compare this to is the killing of Breonna Taylor, and how it took forever for actions to be made, and and at first when the charges weren't made towards the police who did the shooting, and it took a while for actions to be taken, and yeah.
Part 3, action. How do we dismantle anti-Blackness? So we would like to open this question up to y'all. What can we do to dismantle anti-Blackness. I'll give y'all a few moments to think about this and let it ruminate in your mind. Yeah. Thank you. We'll now explain how we can dismantle anti-Blackness. First, we have to address anti-Blackness. Addressing anti-Blackness begins with an authentic reconciliation of an institution's history and legacy of racism. An example of this could be with the state of Mississippi. Their flag has a Confederate flag in the, their state flag has a Confederate flag in the corner, and they have now changed that to a flower to reconciliate with the, fact that the Confederate flag has been associated, has a legacy of racism. So they have changed it, and this is a form of reconciliation.
Another thing we can do to dismantle anti-Blackness is that we can lift Black voices. We can proactively seek students and employees' voices and experiences of anti-Blackness in and out of the classroom and in the workplace. We can intentionally explore the intersection of Black racial/ethnic identity with other salient identities, Black LGBT students, parents, adult learners, student athletes, disabilities, justice impacted, veterans, foster youth, homeless, transfer students. And essentially, we should believe what they say and make the findings public.
Addressing anti-Blackness in campus culture. We can examine the context of teaching and learning in curricula, invisibility and hypersurveillance, persistence and unchecked racial microaggressions. So we can examine the way the campus is ran. We can examine student services as well and make sure that they don't underserve students. For example, saying there's nothing more I can do to help. That would be an example of underserving, that they don't under-challenge Black students. That's a very rigorous major. I'm not sure if that's best for you. And then being welcoming. Why are you here? I'm here to get help. So these are examples of anti-Blackness in campus culture. Additional action for dismantling anti-Blackness, we should critically examine student conduct and discipline data. So for school discipline data, are Black students overrepresented amongst those who are suspended and expelled? Are the punishments equitable? Are parents engaged in the process? For student conduct, are Black students overrepresented amongst those referred to student conduct and for campus policy violations? Do students have access to advice? This could be in the form of lawyers or even pre-help. So are students advised in what behaviors to take so that they don't fall into trouble? To address anti-Blackness in campus and school policing, it's important to analyze the conduct of campus arrests, data citations, referral calls from faculty, a comprehensive view of complaints filed by students, particularly those that allege mistreatment on the basis of race, and assess cultural proficiency in the hiring process. When new staff is brought in, are they taught about anti-Blackness? Are they proficient in anti-Blackness policies and practices? And lastly, desegregate student success data to reveal hidden patterns of racial and inequity. And what this means is that we first, with the access, it's important to see how many Black students applied to that particular school and how many Black students were accepted. Of those Black students, how many of them were previously enrolled or had access to academic enrichment programs? For campus efforts, it's important to examine the Black student faculty to ratio, the proportion of Black students who use campus support services. And then for retention and excellence, I'm going to combine those because they go hand in hand. First, it's important to examine how many first-generation Black students there are, how many Black students graduate, especially how many Black students graduate with honors, and the proportions of Black students who graduate in 4 years, as well as the proportion of Black students who are awarded competitive fellowships, and the amount of Black students who continue their education afterwards if they wish to.
Thank you, Fatima, for concluding our section on dismantling anti-Blackness. Now, finally, we will be going over our closing remarks. So what did we learn today? We learned about anti-Blackness and racism, plus acknowledging its association, and acknowledging white privilege. We learned about anti-Blackness and its prevalence in our education system, especially in our K through 12 history books and especially in college settings. We also learned about how anti-Blackness perpetuates in our cognition and behavior, about the implicit bias and the socialization cycle. Also, how we can dismantle anti-Blackness and the social, and also to tie into how it perpetuates in our cognition and behavior, the socialization impact plus implicit bias. So I would like to take this time to open it up for discussion. I would like to hear what y'all learned from our presentation, and this is completely open to all City College staff and students that are here. And maybe about our takeaways, because one thing I did not know, one thing that stood out to me in the presentation was the video by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. And I know I said this before, but how parents must talk to their children and tell them that, no, like, you are beautiful, you are not dangerous, you're great as you are, because society teaches them the complete opposite. So maybe Fatima, what did you learn, or any?
An anti-Blackness takeaway that I found profound when I was researching is the one about George Floyd. The term anti-Blackness, I wasn't extremely familiar with it until the murder of George Floyd. And then when someone pointed out to me that anti-Blackness didn't start with George Floyd and that it ultimately resulted in his death, that in the context of America, that there is so much anti-Blackness, then I was like, oh, yeah, that's true. And there was just, when I was writing that list, there were so many examples. For instance, the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. I'm aware of this intellectually, but when I start to connect all of these anti-Black events, I'm like, oh, wait, this led to this, which led to this. And you can kind of see how the system is taking place, which kind of leads to the idea that racism is a system. I see a comment in the chat. What are your thoughts about internalized racism in relationship to anti-Blackness? I'll start. As an African American, there's definitely anti-Blackness in the Black community. An example of this would be telling, like, for like girls especially, saying that if you have mixed hair or lighter features, that you're more beautiful, that having good hair is typically hair that is closer to whiteness, closer to like straight hair. And then same with the skin color, having skin that's not too dark is more desirable. Or even you don't want to be too Black or too aggressive or too angry, because that's undesirable in the workforce, that's undesirable to men. So that would be an example in my life of anti-Blackness in the Black community.
I can also answer the question about my thoughts about internalized racism in relation to anti-Blackness. Coming from an Asian community, I was raised and I was told to believe that people that aren't in the community I should be more cautious of and more aware of, because they could be dangerous. And like I was just told that about these stereotypes, which I grew up believing those things. And the older I grew and the more things that I learned about, it it just baffles me. I'm sorry, but it just baffles me that I used to believe those things that were told to me. But yeah, Nancy, I hope I answered your question. It's a learning curve, especially coming from a background and coming from an environment that was anti-Black and like insinuated like anti-Black ways of thinking. And here are our sources for our slides. We hope that y'all enjoyed our presentation, and we hope that you can find the time to take our survey, write a comment, scan the QR code.
The survey doesn't take too much time. It takes roughly 5 minutes, and we will give y'all time to fill out the survey.
In the meantime, please follow us on our social medias, our Instagram, our Facebook, and our YouTube. Our Instagram is at UCSD Cross Cultural Center. Our Facebook is facebook.com/UCSDCCC. And we have a YouTube channel, and we feature videos such as Cooking with the Cross or past webinars held by interns. And there's a QR code to our link tree where you can access our social media, e-news, and the like. And we hope you all enjoyed our presentation and have a great evening. And we will stay for a few minutes and just to hang around if y'all have any questions, comments, concerns. And we also want to give a final thank you to San Diego City College for featuring us and having us here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Fatima and Tiffany and Nancy. This was a wonderful presentation, something that's absolutely very timely as we look to the Black Lives Matter movement that I think, Fatima, you said it properly when you talked about that anti-Blackness did not begin with the murder of George Floyd, but rather it's been going on forever. And while the research that you did and what you referenced in your slide, I was alive and I remember when a lot of those things happened. I remember also having those conversations with my son because he identified as a young Black man. And at the time, he had an encounter also with the police officer at our home after I called the police on a neighbor that tried to hit my son with their vehicle. Nonetheless, that was on his 13th birthday, and I can only tell you that he was so nervous that the police were knocking at the door and just automatically held his hands up from what his father and I had taught him because he didn't want to be shot. As a 13-year-old and being very aware of children being murdered with Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice and Jordan Davis, and the list goes on, unfortunately. But it's something that we have to come to terms with in this country, and there's going to be a reckoning, I feel, because I'm encouraged by what I see in our communities of people coming together for a greater purpose. And one of my colleagues says, we aren't allies, we are co-conspirators. And so I tip my hat to Dr. Bull for that awareness, that enlightenment. But at any rate, I want to thank all of you for coming today. Thank you so much for agreeing to be here at San Diego City College and for, again, giving such a timely workshop. Really appreciate it. At this time, if there is not anything else, Nancy, do you have any closing words that you'd like to say before we end this evening?
I'll go ahead and chime in. I know that the title as it was advertised for this workshop was Black Lives Matter, Anti-Blackness and Intersectionality. And one thing I'd like to underscore is when we say Black Lives Matter, I know folks have said, well, all lives matter or blue lives matter. One thing that is important to remember is the historical context that Fatima and Tiffany outlined, which is that Black folks have been systematically excluded. They've been vilified, as we've seen historically. Black bodies have been devalued. And so I wanted to remind folks of that framework or that lens, and that there's a context for saying Black Lives Matter. So I hope that's one of the takeaways that you all also got from the presentation this evening. And thank you, Lori and San Diego City College staff for having us.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Fatima. We appreciate you being here. And for viewers out there, I want to thank you for tuning in, and I'm confident that you are having a lot of great takeaways. If you have any questions about the presentation or any of the presenters, please hit me up at San Diego City College. My email address is loldham@sdccd.edu. So for now, this is Lori Oldham with Office of Student Affairs saying good night. Thank you for joining us.